Chapter 2. The Last Camp. Kendra did not quite run back to the caravan. That would have been too conspicuous by half, and there was no reason for it, none at all. With deliberate ease, she hung the crossbow over her shoulder as if nothing was wrong. And in fact, nothing was wrong, she reminded herself forcefully. She took the body unceremoniously under her cloak, as much to put it from her own sight as from others. It wouldn't do to have someone stop to question her, or worse, take it. Not when there was someone who was going to be so terribly pleased to see this prize. Well, not see, exactly, she corrected herself wryly, as she approached the last wagon in the column. Kendra began to place her feet with caution, avoiding each twig that might give her away, moving in near total silence. She was just about to congratulate herself when a half-peeled and overripe apple came sailing from between the curtains and took her squarely in the forehead.
"And just where did you up and run off to then, Miss Kendra?"
drawled the familiar, deep voice from somewhere just out of sight. Kendra smiled, even as she rubbed her damp, stinging brow. He always did know. "Oh, I thought I might see about pulling my weight around here," she replied speculatively, sinking into the sarcasm like the comfort of a warm bath. "I mean, I'd just feel awful if I were to sit around all day, eavesdropping and getting into everyone's business." The curtains to the carriage, clean but unremarkable, parted with a slow majesty like the great doors of a warm and welcoming temple. A pale, lined face, pinched with that immortal and shared expression of old men confronting the dismal state of the youth of today, peered over her with milky eyes.
"Child, I would beat you," he rumbled, "were it not a waste of my immense and nearly limitless skills and abilities, as well as my far smaller supplies of time and energy."
The stocky old man swept the curtains to the side fully, bathing her in light and warmth, and stood to his full height. Small, but he did not feel small. He seemed always to have that sort of presence in his carriage, now fully in view. The space was laid out tightly and efficiently to show the little kitchen, complete with working surfaces, a set of knives secured carefully to the walls of the rattling cart, and rows of vegetables lying in various stages of readiness and freshness. A stove sat neatly in a corner, a heavy kettle set to boil.
"And I shall find it easier still to forgive when you fork over whatever it is you've got there that you're so proud of."
With an exasperated grin, she swung the hare over to him. In trade, he handed her an apple and a knife.
"Peel?"
"You're the one who wasted the last one," Kendra objected. "Maybe don't throw it at my head if you're going to be fussy about it."
"It was not a waste," Boris said calmly. "I used that apple to teach an impudent whippersnapper a lesson about sneaking up on folks 10 times cleverer than her. Now, my whippersnapper, it is time for you to repay that lesson. Peel."
Chuckling, she did. He grunted with satisfaction as he hefted the hare, hands examining it in a businesslike blur.
"Not bad, Miss Kendra, not bad."
He waved her up.
"In, you're letting the heat out."
Boris slapped the body onto a cutting board and began to expertly dismantle it, cutting and tugging the skin away in a few swift motions. Kendra had at one time been a bit queasy with such butchery, but Boris did his work with an artistry and expertise that she could not help but to admire.
"And you were appointed to this task, O great huntress?" he asked in his stride, eyes closed as the knife flashed in his hands, cleaving through tendons. "That's what Miss Moira told you to be doing?" Kendra grimaced at the question, turning her face from unpleasant to outright frightening. "Yes, Boris," she said, in a bright tone, out of sorts with her expression. "I was just keeping watch, and it went by. Nothing to it." Boris turned ponderously to her, skewering her with the gaze she knew to be unseeing, but still felt utterly penetrating. "Is that right?" he stated flatly. It was not a question. "Little Bunny sits on by as the whole caravan rattles over his burrow and just waits for you to scoop him right on up by the tail, huh?" He turned back to his work and brought down the blade with a resounding thud. "That was lucky, wasn't it?" Kendra smoothed back her hair reflexively as she let out something between a groan and a nervous laugh. He always did know, she cursed to herself. "Okay, Boris, okay," she admitted with the air of one calming the beast awoken from its nap. "It ran, so I walked just a little ways to chase it. Not far," she added hastily, as Boris's mouth contorted to a truly alarming look of displeasure and his chest filled like great bellows preparing for a scouring blast. "You know, everyone does it now and then. I wanted to help. Thomas had been asking for fresh meat, and you're always talking about food being tight, and I was back before anyone could miss me." The rambling petered out, and Boris exhaled long and heavily, not turning away from his bloody work. "Not a lot of people around here would miss you, Miss Kendra, even if you didn't come back." He said it without heat, and in that moment he was as old as she had ever seen him. "They're used to it. Greenhorns on their first ride wander off, and the caravan doesn't wait long. Everyone around here knows they're not coming back most of the time. The garden keeps what it catches." In that moment he was as carved stone, peering distantly at faces that only he now remembered. Then he continued his chopping. "Most people are smart enough not to miss you if you're gone, so how's about you don't put all that on old Boris now? I've got enough troubles of my very own that I don't need to be crying over dead fools." Boris waved with his knife towards the exit in what was an unmistakable dismissal, and Kendra left the carriage, a mumbled apology in her wake. The cooling air of the evening did nothing to ease the hot shame blossoming across her scarred cheeks. "Stupid," she reprimanded herself. She knew better. They were only at the edge of the garden, and at a glance these woods were not so much wilder than any others. It was the smell that told the true story. There was something heavy and green in the air of this place, something that pinched at her nose. She'd grown somewhat used to it in these few days, but even then there was always something to tug at her senses. Little movements in the shadows, rustlings nearby in the dead of night. These were the witch woods. The very words unsettled some deep awareness in her, a dark bedtime story at her mother's knee, words she'd heard whispered in hushed tones for as long as she could remember. Stuffing hands into pockets in frustration, she vowed to do better. In her guilt, she had to acknowledge that some small part of her had been pulled into the woods by the thrill of it. This was a place out of the tales she'd always loved. Adventure on the open road, a strange land, the faintest whisperings of magic.
just beyond the river, was myth and legend come alive. With a snort of disgust, Kendra gave herself a sharp slap across the cheek. Are you really this naive? These are children's fancies. Grow up. At least, she consoled herself, Thomas would have the fresh meat he'd so wanted. She knew the boy would still be in the wagon just over there, shaking with fever. She thought he looked to be getting better, but such things were never certain. She'd known hardier men than Thomas to burn out and die in such a fever, strong as an oak one day and felled the next. Kendra was lost in thought when a call went out into the fading light, and the caravan came to a halt. The river shushed along to her right, marking the course of the caravan. It was that one clear landmark that made navigation possible. Here, even seasoned eyes could become lost in short order. She stepped into the bustle, as much to escape her thoughts as to help. Rough and busy folk pushed past one another, a messy warren of unfurling tasks. The wagons curled into a defensible formation, a crescent with its back to the river. The path was not wide enough to accept a full circle, so their flank was defended by fire, water, and keen eyes. At the center of the maelstrom of activity, a woman of middling years consulted a paper with a reedy man, and allowed the work to unfold around her. She was unremarkable, with a visage one might see 5 of in any market-place in the kingdom, and yet the camp turned on its axis around her, its beating heart. Alongside her ongoing conversation, she gave a low, clear word here, a gesture in a direction there, and the apparent chaos moved to her command. Kendra did not make eye contact, tried her best to seem insignificant. It was a fair guise, helped by mostly being true, but still utterly futile. "A moment, please, Plum Blossom," came the command, quiet but completely clear over the bedlam of the camp. Kendra turned to face the mistress, her cheeks taking on the characteristic shade that had earned the nickname. "Mistress Moira," she acknowledged respectfully. With a crook of the finger, Moira summoned Kendra to her. "Enthusiasm for feeding your caravan mates is all well and good," she said in a mild undertone, "but if I discover that you have wandered off unannounced again, you will be given an object lesson in what it takes to feed this caravan while you are cleaning Boris's pots for the next month. Am I understood?" Kendra gaped, but only for a moment. "Of course, mistress." With a nod, she was dismissed, and let herself be carried breathlessly away on the currents of the camp. Moira always took her in with that cultivated ordinariness, the broken branch that turned out to be a viper. Kendra never saw her coming, and undoubtedly that was the point. The only opulence the mistress allowed herself was the truly beautiful rapier at her side, hilt set with engraved silver. It was a piece of whimsy totally at odds with the rest of her appearance, not that anyone would dare say so. Gathering logs from the back of a nearby supply wagon, Kendra started the business of the pyre that would form the hub of the night's activity. The road wore hard on them all, but many in the group still found it in themselves to engage in a bit of revelry at the end of the day. Moira allowed drinking, with the understanding that a hangover in the morning would be awarded no clemency from the work to be done. For her own part, Kendra did not partake in the carousing. The travels were still new and painful, her body aching mightily at the end of each day's work. Not that there hadn't been offers of drink and more. As one of her more uncouth colleagues had put it,
After a few rounds, the face isn't what counts.
Instead, she threw herself into her work, meticulously arranging the wood, interlacing long, dry logs into a square as she had been taught. Lying low to the ground, Kendra fluffed her kindling, put a spark to it, and blew into the structure with steady, firm puffs. The wood popped and flames flickered into being with a flash of heat and light, tongues stretching out in satisfaction.
"Oh, Crispy, what's that there?" a voice said above her.
She lurched, tossed from deep concentration. The big man guffawed behind his armful of fabric and rope, passing her roughly by.
"Scared of the fire going up, hmm? Oh, but Moira's got a cruel sense of humor."
Kendra gave him a mask of a smile and waved him off in gentle dismissal, returning her focus to nursing the fire. This jibe was not the first, and many years of pointing and whispering had long taught her the correct response to such abuse. It did little good to put more thought to it. Her face was her face, and fire would always be around. At the end of the day, she was glad to have it bright and near. Mostly. And this was her fire, hers to kindle or let die, and her duty here to her caravan mates, even if they could be crude, half-literate asses at times. She shook them from her mind and lost herself in the act. With the care of a nurse cradling a babe, she stoked the fire until it laughed hot and fierce. Laborers milled about, lingering an extra few moments in its radiance before setting to hurriedly complete their tasks. Boris shuffled out, waddling along with a massive pot in hand. With the efficiency of a true master, he set forth iron scaffolds around the blaze and set the pot to stew. Kendra ducked in for a peek into the pot, trying to catch a whiff of the dinner-to-be, but Boris swatted her away with a stern glower. She held up her hands placatingly and backed away to leave him to his ritual of simmering and spice. As the stew began to bubble and required less of his attentions, Boris beckoned Kendra to the mossy stump by his side. His face was serious, and she knew he had not forgotten his displeasure of earlier. As near as she could tell, there was precious little he ever did forget.
"You've been quick on the pickup, young miss," he said as he stirred, face shrouded in vapors.
His voice was clear but soft, and she suspected that, through the general activity of the camp and the crackle of the flames, someone even a few paces further away wouldn't hear him.
"Doing well here. I've seen it. Even these louts around here know you're doing fine work."
He paused, lifting the ladle to his lips to taste the thick broth before reaching for corrective seasonings.
"I was hard on you today and sent you off with your tail between your legs, and I don't much like doing that. But you can't be running off alone. You won't survive this place like that."
Kendra began to respond, but Boris lifted a finger.
"Let me speak my piece. I've a story you should hear. There was a greenhorn, years back now, when you were knee-high to me, name of Lyra. Good girl, smart, confident, funny. Ah, lords, but she was quick. We all loved her, even Moira."
He grinned broadly as Kendra stirred in surprise.
"Yes, mean old Moira. Well, she was younger then. Still tough as a birch rod, mind you, but this girl, there weren't nobody that could say no to that smile. Moira took to her like a daughter. The way Moira talked, she would have been her second in command in a few years' time."
He stirred fondly, lost in memories, before sighing and continuing.
Lyra, she loved to carve. She was a natural, near as good as any fancy city artisan. She was always twiddling away at a piece of wood. Beautiful stuff,
he breathed. He paused and fished something from his pocket, extending it to Kendra for consideration. It was a hand-carved badger, simple, cut into a dark wood and the edges smoothed by years of handling, oiled to a fine sheen. Its eyes twinkled, strong and proud as a real beast of the rough woodlands, and for a moment Kendra was spellbound.
She said it suited me, stubborn and ornery, he recalled.
And though it was hard to tell in the dusky firelight, Kendra thought there was a shining at the corner of his eyes.
One day, she was gone. We stopped the caravan, looked for hours. Eventually she turned up, saying that she'd seen a twinkling just off the trail. She didn't seem to know the time that had passed. And she came back with a knife.
Boris's tone grew brusque and curt, any uncharacteristic sentiment drying away like a desert rain.
She'd said she'd found it in a clearing nearby, just sitting there. The thing was old, covered in ruins. Well, you know about this place. You know about the treasure hunters that come here sometimes.
Kendra nodded. The witchwoods were an object of fear where she came from, but there was a certain glamour to them as well. It was said that if a man could bring an artifact out of the deep places there, he might live like a king for the rest of his days.
Boris snorted. Well, I imagine you know most don't come back again. We here walk the safest paths, and we don't stay for long. We don't muck around with nothing like that. Moira told her to throw away the knife, but Lyra, she wouldn't hear of it. 'Twas a handsome blade, sharp and strong, and she took to carving with it.
In that moment, Boris might have been a statue, his lips moving almost imperceptibly.
From then on, she never showed us anything else she was working on. She'd hide it when someone came to see her. She got, well, she weren't herself. Prickly, always angry. There were times we couldn't find her, but then she'd turn up right where she ought to have been. Said she'd been there the whole time. She started to get a sickly look about her, pale and gaunt-like. We didn't know what to make of it. Tried to talk to her about it, but she always said she was fine. And then...
Boris's voice shook and died, face shrouded in smoke.
We found her one morning. She'd gone at one of the old-timers, a good bloke, name of Sven. By the time we got to her, she'd carved him up something terrible with that knife of hers.
Kendra's mouth was dry, stomach turning. She took a nervous glance back at Boris's wagon, where she knew the rabbit's corpse lay, bloodied and skinless. "You don't think what I brought you today?"
Boris laughed hoarsely. "No, I don't, young miss. I'm not much concerned by what's dead, as a general rule."
"The knife wasn't alive, though," she pointed out uneasily.
"If you say so, lass."
Kendra almost laughed, but there was not even a spark of humor in Boris's eyes. She shivered. "And Lyra? What happened to her?" "I cut her throat," came the voice, sharp and clear behind her. Gasping, Kendra turned to see Moira passing along the edge of the clearing. Her eyes, cool and impassive, met Kendra's shocked gaze. She said nothing else and walked on. Kendra watched Moira go before turning back to Boris. "You said Lyra was like a daughter to Moira," she said softly, feeling sick.
"She was gone, Miss Kendra," Boris said, eyes far away. "You can't know. Laughing and shrieking and covered in blood. Later, in her things, we found what she'd been carving. It was all wrong."
They sank into a deep silence like the still waters of a forgotten well. Quietly, Kendra flexed her hands that had turned to white-knuckled fists. It was not the girl's death that unsettled her. It was the changes. To become so monstrous as to bring pain and torment to anyone she held close, anyone that might have cared. That was worse than death by far. She glanced at Boris, and for a moment she thought of him in the place of the hair, the crossbow bolt through his chest. She stood abruptly. "I'm sorry," she said thickly, stumbling over her words. "I didn't mean to bring all this up for you. I'm sure this isn't something you like to think about."
"It's not," Boris agreed. "But if there's one good thing about being an old man, it's that I can tell callow youths about all the mistakes that they oughtn't make. Who knows? Maybe they'll even listen."
He cocked an eyebrow, making it a question, and she nodded hurriedly.
"Good. Proper listening is a survival skill, so learn it quick and learn it well. Now, run along. Supper's not for a while yet." He waved her off.
Kendra started to go, then paused. "What happened to the knife? The one that—" Boris did not turn from his pot.
"Gone. It got tossed aside when we found her with Sven. We never could find it."
Settling onto the pile of wood that she would feed into the fire as the night went on, Kendra slumped her shoulders. The day had been long, her body unused to the travel, and her back arched marvelously over her perch, a heavy sigh passing her lips as she sank into it. She was too tired and full of thoughts even to crack open her book tonight. She could feel the fire's radiant heat from here, at a comfortable distance, and marveled at Boris as he moved, face to the inferno. Her eyes were drawn to the deep white crucible of flames, a brilliant waterfall in reverse, stretching away to the heavens. Lyra had probably sat like this, years ago, stoking the fire, watching him cook. She couldn't imagine that Boris looked any different now. He had that kind of eternal face. The smoke fanned over her head, smudging the world around her, the deep crackling pulling her away as her eyes unfocused and unconsciousness tugged at her mind. She was looking down over the trees, silver-leafed in the light of the heavy moon on the horizon. She circled round and round, casting about small, sharp eyes for that which was missing. In the distance she saw the two enormous towers peering from beyond the canopy, structures she knew to be strong and imperious, now as blades of grass among the dark ocean of trees. The sight filled her with longing, but she hardened herself to the task now in her talons. Below, a gap in the trees revealed a spot of vibrant red in the green. She reeled, body and mind, before throwing herself into a deep dive. She could smell it. Blood and iron.